My name is Simon Phillips, and I am part of a project called DarWin. So the album is called Origin of Species. It's about the future and what is happening to our world today. DarWin approached me almost 4 years ago, out of the blue, asking me if I would be interested in producing his record. I had no idea who he was, I had no idea what the music was like, but the emails I was getting were very interesting. He did have a very clear vision, and we met one day at my studio, Phantom Recordings, and we started recording. We started playing the first track after I'd basically done an arrangement of it, a track called For Humanity. My approach to production is, I like the Phil Ramone approach. I like to basically, I don't really say much until I feel it's necessary to say something. I like to create a nice atmosphere for everybody to work in. I'm usually engineering myself, and off we go. I'm a big believer of live tracking. That's my approach, very organic. We continued in this fashion. We did a couple of recording days, maybe a couple of weeks would go by, then DarWin would come back with a couple more songs, and before we knew it, we had a whole album's worth of material. And I started mixing some of these tracks. Little did I know that there was an awful lot more to go on these tracks, because he was having all these ideas. And 3 years later, we had a total of 17 songs, all mixed and ready to go. And that is an album called Origin of Species. Mixing this record was quite a task. Whenever you have a lot of parts, a lot of instruments, a lot of voices, you can get to the point of no return. And so therefore you have to start weeding out things that are not really helping the mix. I don't mind recording more than I need to, especially if somebody's got a plethora of ideas. For example, with the vocal harmonies, I think we probably, in a lot of these songs, had every possible harmony you could have, just to see if it would work, see how it would work. But obviously, in most cases, we didn't use all of the vocals, all the harmonies, because it was just overkill. But it's still quite a challenge. You may have, 24 tracks full of just vocals, all different harmonies. Typically, most harmonies I would triple track, or maybe even 4 sometimes, and then other ones I'd only have 2. So they all have different timbres, but that would take quite a lot of time to find the right balance of the harmony to start with. And of course, the more you add, sonically it starts to get very muddy, so you've got to be very careful how you treat each, let's say, bank of harmonies. The higher harmonies will probably need some different EQ to the lower harmonies, for example. So it takes a long time to put all this together. And then, of course, string. On some of the songs, Escape the Maze, for example, we actually have an orchestra in Abbey Road Studios. And that was recorded over in London, and I was sent the stems, and suddenly there's another 6 faders to add into this mix of a very full sound. The thing I've enjoyed about recording this record is I've been able to use a lot of my early experiences, both as a session musician in London and also as an engineer working with people like Mike Oldfield. Mike's albums were always very dense. We had a lot of instruments. We only had 24 tracks in those days. Which means actually 23 tracks, because one track was a SMPTE track for sync. But what we used to do in those days was we would bounce from a couple of tracks, a little bit like the old EMI recordings of the Beatles. If you wanted an overdub, you had to bounce from one tape machine to another whilst playing a live part. So, and I used to do that as a kid with my mum had 2 Revox G36 tape machines. And so I used to play with these all the time and bouncing and then adding something else. And it was great fun. As track counts got bigger, and we went from 1/4-inch tape to 1/2 inch to 1 inch to 2 inch, the maximum was actually a 32-track machine. I believe it was a Telefunken. But most of the time we were using 24-track. So you'd have to bounce, let's say, all the vocals, which are maybe 8 tracks, down to 2 tracks, and then add more vocals, and then bounce again. And today with Pro Tools, we have a gazillion tracks to play with, which is great, but sometimes can be a curse as well, because there's always somebody saying, let's add something more. But the great thing about my early experiences was I did a lot of sessions where it was rhythm section and orchestra. And I would always go into the control room, and I got to know all the engineers in London, and I was just fascinated by the whole recording process. And trying to put together a big orchestra and a rock group is a very difficult thing. First of all, it's very difficult to record live. Luckily for this project, we didn't have to do that. But still, you have to mix it. And that takes a lot of doing. I have to say it's difficult. It's not easy, especially if you don't do it all the time. And I certainly don't do that all the time. But it was great to be able to use the experience that I had in the 70s of seeing that done and seeing how the engineer would work and how he would balance the orchestra and the rhythm section. And I think that really helped mixing this record. I was able to bring in some techniques from the analog world, from the 70s, into today's world, which is all digital, but I still think very analog.
The revolution came in waves.
We're in an age where we have a lot of machinery. When I say that, we have a lot of instruments that play real instruments, but they're not real instruments, they're virtual instruments. So even down to the simplest part of the song, the tempo. What is the right tempo? When we recorded records in the 70s, there was a bunch of us. We didn't have a drum machine. We didn't have a sequencer. So we would all play, and we didn't even have a click. We would just kind of, maybe the songwriter would play his guitar, and that sounds like a good tempo, and you try to remember that tempo, and you play, and then you go, feels a bit slow, let's try it a bit faster. When humans are playing a song, depending on the structure of the song, the key it's in, the chord sequence, there's a tempo that works. And as long as you can find that, then your song goes down and it plays itself, basically. Of course, in those days, without a click, most tunes change tempo. You'd be amazed how many hit records start off at one speed and end at a different speed. Sometimes they speed up, sometimes they actually slow down. Nothing wrong with it. Classical music moves around all the time. But since the advent of the drum machine and the click track, we've become very metronomic. Now the problem is that the machine plays anything perfectly at any tempo. So it's very easy to kind of forget the tempo because it's sounding great. But when you go out there to start playing, I can instantly go, this just doesn't feel right. It's not working. And that's when I'll stop and go in and say, guys, let's change the tempo. It's not right. And maybe I'll ask the band, actually, let's play without the click. Let's just play the song. And we'll try a few different tempos. And once I feel that we've got one that's right, then I'll go, And I'll get up from the drums and I'll keep counting and I'll get a metronome and I'll start tapping it in and go, okay. And it may only be 1 beat per minute, maybe 2 beats per minute different to what we originally had, but it made all the world of difference. And that's kind of almost the first part of the song to get right, is the tempo. When you have an album with lots of different songs, keys are very important. The singer, the key is very important to the singer. How do you want the singer to sound? Most singers can sing in a variety of keys, but of course their voice changes. That's something that's very, very important. You have to make sure it's the right one. So it's kind of handy when you're tracking to have the singer there. And we were very lucky in Matt Bissonette, who played bass on a lot of the tracks. He sang most of the tracks, so we could always check for key. I like to do some very subtle key changes and would suggest, hey, what about this section? Let's transpose this just a whole step. And DarWin would go, oh, wow, okay, Matt. And Matt would say, yeah, actually, that would work great. So we're constantly evolving. We may be up to maybe take 4 or take 5, and I don't like to do too many takes, just a couple of takes, and then we'll go and listen. And I go, how about this section? What if we change this, I think I even a couple of times said, why don't we put that in 7? Huh? Well, it's in 4 at the moment, the meter. That would sound really good in 7/4. Okay, so we had to learn how to play it, and it worked. Many of these songs started out one way and ended in a different way. And I can only really credit all the wonderful people I've worked with, and the many hours of sitting in a control room with a producer, even as an engineer or as a player, trying different ways. Typically in the 70s, we would do loads of takes, many reels of tape. It was just kind of a thing that we did. We'd try in different keys, in different tempos, as I said before. But it was wonderful to take all that experience and put it into a project like this, which wasn't just a few songs, which is typically what happens today. It was a whole, an album, then it became 2 albums, a double album. So it was really quite an undertaking, but it was a lot of fun.
The revolution will come in waves. Augmented dreams. Augmented